what he was buying it for, but here was this entire keyboard, this organ, including the stops, which was very unusual to find all of that functioning. It wasn't playable, but it all functioned. The keys moved and the stops pulled and closed. He had the pipes cast and plaster and gold leafed and did all that ornate Rococo work to the framework at the top of the organ. And it was just this marvelous centerpiece, which for a mere $50 had been purchased. Speaking of props, this bench right here is the bench that James Mason sat at when he played Toccata and Fugue.
At the start of the production, the sets for 20,000 Leagues were the primary financial concern for Disney and his brother Roy. But the cost of the sets, as well as all other production problems, were eclipsed by one scene in the film, a nightmare sequence that to this day remains legendary in Hollywood.
The most difficult, maybe the most famous sequence in the picture is the battle with the giant squid.
They built stage 3 out here as a stage with a pool specifically for this movie in order to stage a few of the submarine scenes, but most specifically the fight with the giant squid.
With depths ranging from 3 to 18 feet, the tank would house the full-size deck of the Nautilus and the attacking giant squid, and would also be used for some of the film's numerous underwater miniature shots. Construction of the new stage added $300,000 to the steadily rising costs of the production, but that was just the beginning of a long string of crushing expenses.
It started out to be an absolute total disaster in every sense of the word.
In the script, it's described in one simple sentence. And screenwriter Earl Felton could never have known the amount of aggravation, money, and frustration that was going to be caused by that one brief description.
I reckoned it would be very dramatic if, and I was doing sketches on the film quite a lot, that if we did a red, deep red sky and the squid comes out of the water, it would be a wonderful effect. Well, they tried it. They put on a kind of washy-washy sky, and it looked ridiculous.
The light was very rich and pink and sort of peaceful. And it struck a number of us immediately that it didn't look like the setting for a serious struggle.
On March the 10th, 1954, director Richard Fleischer and cinematographer Franz Planer enthusiastically began shooting the squid scene. But it soon became obvious to everyone that it was going to be a frighteningly massive case of special effects that would never work, and in fact were capable of sinking the entire movie. The Sunset Squid Fight, as it was called, became every producer's nightmare.
The squid was practically worthless. The squid that had been built in the studio was a great big blob of something, I don't know what. It had all the tentacles, but the tentacles were held up by very heavy cable, which you couldn't avoid seeing, and operated from up in the flies by puppeteers, I guess you'd call them.
There were no clouds to hide the wires as the wires moved the squid's arms and stuff.
The cables would break, or great hunks of the material would come apart, come off. And the inside was stuffed with kapok, and it was absorbing the water. So it got heavier and heavier and getting less and less mobile, and it was just impossible. So I'm trying to shoot this thing, and I'm sick to my stomach looking at it because I know it's not working.
And I wasn't there at the time, but everybody knew what happened. They took it in and ran it for Walt, and the squid just simply looked fake.
And Walt Disney shows up. He said, I just saw your dailies. And he said, I've been watching what you're doing here. He said, you're making a Keystone comedy cops movie. This is terrible. I said, Walt, don't tell me about it. I know what it is, and I explained the situation. And he understood that right away. He could see what was happening.
And I saw some of this stuff later, and Lord knows, it looked awful fake.
Disney halted the shooting on March the 17th.
He said, start a dramatic sequence and leave the squid sequence alone. He said, I'll get together with my geniuses at Disneyland and we'll come up with a squid that will do something for you. It'll be much better than this.
He knew that if the problem wasn't solved, the entire film would be a failure.
My writer, Errol Felton, had seen the dailies too. And I said, you know, Earl, what are we going to do with this thing? It doesn't work. Even if we get a good squid. He said, well, look, everything's wrong with this sequence. This should be a sequence that takes place at night in a violent storm with lightning and thunder and wind, tremendous wind, waves smashing everything. So it becomes not just a fight against the squid, but a fight against nature as well. You'll only see the squid really in flashes of lightning, and you won't see any flaws that it may have. So I kissed his hand and ran out to find Walt. And I ran right into Walt on the studio street. And I said, Walt, this is the new concept for the squid fight. And he listened and he said, you're absolutely right. He didn't hesitate a minute. That's the way we'll do it. And you tell Earl to write that sequence.
The trouble was with the storm, it was horribly expensive.
And everybody said, oh my God, that'll cost twice as much as you've already spent and not going to use. And he said, I don't care, we've got to do it.
It cost an additional $250,000, which it doesn't sound like a lot, but in 1954, that was a lot to add to the budget.
The guy was, you know, he wasn't stingy that way. He wanted this film to be the best it could, and it turned out being the very best it could.
The two squid fights were written and conceived differently, with action sequences as well as physical settings that bore little resemblance to one another. Also, the two squids themselves were drastically different, not only in their operation, but also in their outward appearance and coloring.
And Chris Mueller actually sculpted that big squid, which was pretty an amazing feat in itself, because it was full size. I mean, it's the biggest squid anybody's ever seen.
Mueller redesigned the shape of the giant squid so that its 8 tentacles, now tapered at the end to make them more like snakes, could stretch out to twice their length. Meanwhile, the problems with manipulating the tentacles were solved by mechanical effects expert Bob Matty.
They came up with a way of making a spring device. It looked like a spring, and the latex was actually put on that. And so it was light as a feather, and you could get all this fluid movement that way. And that's why that thing looked totally realistic in the movie. It was just incredible.
The full-size squid it had some working parts, particularly the mouth, and it was made of a combination of cast rubber and cast plastic. It looked very convincing.
Mueller added a brow ridge to give the squid a menacing look, as well as shortened the squid's normal elongated shape to something more bulbous. Now weighing in at almost 2 tons, the new squid was fully operational, thanks to Bob Matty. But it took a crew of 28 men to bring it to life. Every arm was full length, attached to the squid's body and fully functional, so that they writhed realistically.
They found a way to articulate the squid by using vacuum hoses in the arms to allow the arms to curl when inflated and to go straight when deflated. So it created the illusion of actual movement.
Besides constructing a completely different giant squid, reshooting the sequence to depict a storm also meant acquiring costly wind machines, water cannon, huge dump tanks and wave makers, as well as re-engineering the deck of the Nautilus so it could be tilted during the fight.
Walt had built a wave machine at one end of the tank, which was very effective. And it was lit mostly by lightning. It was very exciting. And the camera was moved and tilted and took part of it. And the fight was convincing. But the heavy rain was blown 15, 20 feet up into the insulation on the stage. Stage 3 didn't dry out for several years.
here's this gigantic squid, tentacles suspended by these cables and what have you, and this water and the Nautilus, and they were in the throes of doing that battle scene. And I remember standing watching that, wrapped up in raincoats and what have you, because the amount of water that was getting thrown around in that set with those huge stage fans and all the water from the storm and what have you. It was an amazing thing to witness as a young kid. It would have been amazing as an adult to stand there and witness that.
And we got in a special director to do most of that storm. He worked under awful conditions.
The second unit director, Jim Havens, was renowned for directing larger-than-life stunt scenes, and actually shot more of the squid sequence than the principal director, Richard Fleischer.
They had about 30 wind machines in there. In those days, they were old airplane engines with a caged propeller. They'd just crank up these airplane engines and go full throttle with them, and they were pouring fire hoses of water into the wind stream from them, so the rain was coming sideways. I was told that 3 different people wound up with pneumonia afterwards. Water was flowing out every door of the soundstage about a foot deep.
As far as I know, no one got hurt. I think one of the animators who had wandered in that stage to watch the proceedings, and then when the doors came down, he got locked in. And at the end of the scene, of course, he was soaking wet and scared to death because he was afraid he was going to be electrocuted because water was everywhere. Oh, I was in the same place. I got wet too.
When you have a movie that is physical, to me, it's like a vacation. When you have an emotional scene, it's very much more tiring than a physical scene if you're in reasonable condition.
There was one mishap during the filming of the second squid sequence, where James Mason was almost injured. During Captain Nemo's rescue scene, Mason was held at a specific angle by a thin cable attached to his feet. Kirk Douglas was completely unaware that as he pulled Mason through the water, the cable was tightening and Mason was being forced underwater. The other actors and camera safety men suddenly realized what was happening and immediately jumped into the water to pull him out. Mason quickly recovered and reshot the scene. After all was said and done, the reshoot with the second squid and the dramatic nighttime fight sequence was worth the gamble.
It was this sequence in many ways that really made the movie go over the top.
But it almost ruined the studio because it cost so much to redo it.
Cost overruns reached critical mass just 4 weeks after Fleischer finished photography on the second squid fight.
So much so that, and this is like halfway through the schedule, so much so that we're about to run out of money. And that would close down the picture, maybe close the studio. And it was the added cost was brought on by this redoing the sequence and trying to do it the proper way.
Production overages on the film were now eating into money to be used in constructing Disneyland. Walt Disney needed more money in a hurry.
They had to get in the bankers. They were asked them to supply money to finish the picture, and the bankers wanted to see what had been shot up to date. And that was a big day for us. I was working on the set, waiting to hear word whether we were going to come back to work the next day or shut down that night. It was really that close. Word got back to me. They loved it, and they're giving him $1.5 million to finish the picture. That's our squid story. It was a real hair-raiser movie in itself.